The Forgotten Army. The Second World War is remembered as a battle of nations: Germany, Britain, America, Russia. But behind the flags and the famous faces were millions of men whose names never entered the history books. Men who spoke Arabic, Urdu, Malay, Persian, and Swahili. Men who prayed before battle and whispered God's name in languages the officers around them could not understand. They fought in deserts that burned by day and froze by night. They marched through jungles so thick the sun disappeared. They crossed mountains, oceans, and continents under flags that were not their own. They were Muslims, 3 million of them, scattered across every front of the Second World War. From North Africa to Burma, from the Russian steppes to the fields of France, they fought, bled, and died in a war that was never truly theirs. Some wore the khaki of the British Empire, others the blue of Free France, some the red of the Soviet Star. Many had never even seen Europe, yet they were told its fate rested in their hands. They built bridges, carried ammunition, flew planes, treated the wounded. They faced the same bullets, the same fear, the same death. But when the war ended, their stories vanished in the noise of victory. No monuments bore their names, no parades welcomed them home. They returned to lands still under foreign rule, where the medals on their chests meant nothing, and the countries they fought for forgot them. And yet, without them, the outcome of the war might have been very different. Their courage helped stop fascism. Their sacrifice built the peace that followed, but history buried them under silence. This is their story, the forgotten Muslim soldiers of World War II. Chapter 1. The Empire's Invisible Soldiers. When war erupted in 1939, the British Empire stretched across the globe, and so did its armies. From Cairo to Calcutta, millions were called to fight for a king most had never seen, in a language they barely understood. Among them were nearly 2 million Muslims from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Burma, the largest volunteer army the world had ever seen. They came from dusty villages and crowded bazaars, farmers and laborers who suddenly became soldiers in the greatest war in human history. They trained under the tropical sun, learned to march, to shoot, to obey. They were told this was a fight for freedom, though freedom was something they themselves did not yet have. The British called them sepoys, soldiers of the Empire. They fought wherever the Empire needed them, in North Africa against Rommel's tanks, in Italy's frozen mountains, in the jungles of Burma. Their food was simple, their pay small, their equipment second-hand. Yet their endurance was legendary. In the deserts of Libya, Indian Muslim soldiers prayed in the sand between artillery barrages. In Burma, they fought side by side with Gurkhas and Sikhs against the Japanese. Letters sent home spoke of longing, of hunger, and of the strange faces they fought beside. Many wrote verses from the Quran on small scraps of paper and kept them inside their helmets for protection. They had no illusions about glory. For them, war was duty, a way to protect their families, their faith, and perhaps earn a better life when it was over. Few imagined they would become the backbone of the Allied war machine. By 1945, more than 400,000 Indian soldiers had been wounded, captured, or killed. Yet their names rarely appeared in Western newspapers. When victory came, they stood quietly at the back of the parade, watching others celebrate. Still, their courage had carried empires across continents. They were the invisible soldiers, unseen, unthanked, but impossible to forget once you know their story. Chapter 2. The Desert and the Faith. Across the Mediterranean, another army of forgotten men was fighting beneath the same sun. They were the Muslim soldiers of North Africa, from Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and Senegal, serving under the French flag. Most had been conscripted from colonies. Some volunteered, hoping for respect, others simply for a meal and a sense of purpose. In 1940, when France fell to the Nazis, these men were among the first to continue the fight under General Charles de Gaulle's Free French forces. They crossed deserts, climbed mountains, and pushed through the ruins of Europe, wearing worn-out boots and carrying old rifles. In North Africa, they faced Rommel's Afrika Korps, seasoned German troops armed with tanks and superior weapons. The French officers often stayed behind the lines, while the colonial soldiers did the bleeding. In battles like El Alamein and Kasserine Pass, their bravery held the line when Europe seemed doomed. Later, they were sent to Italy. At Monte Cassino, Moroccan and Algerian troops climbed cliffs under heavy fire to break the German defense, one of the fiercest battles of the war. They fought through snow and mud, fasting during Ramadan, praying in bombed-out chapels, whispering verses of faith before the charge. When the Allies entered southern France in 1944, these same Muslim soldiers were in the vanguard. Villagers cheered them as liberators, unaware that they came from far across the sea. For a brief moment, the world saw them, the men in turbans and fezzes who helped free Europe from tyranny. But when the war ended, their reward was silence. Many were discharged without pay or recognition. Some were sent back to colonies still under occupation, their sacrifices erased from official memory. France celebrated liberation, but not the liberators who didn't look French. For the North African soldiers, faith had been their strength. In the desert and in the snow, they believed that every act of courage was seen, even if no one thanked them. Their officers may have forgotten their names, but they believed that God never would. Chapter 3. The Soviet Muslims. Far to the east, another front was burning, colder, harsher, and even more brutal. When Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, the call to defend the motherland reached as far as Central Asia and the Caucasus. Millions of Muslims from modern-day Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, Chechnya, and Tatarstan were drafted into the Red Army. They were farmers, shepherds, poets, and students, suddenly turned into soldiers facing the most devastating invasion in human history. Many had never seen snow before, yet they found themselves fighting knee-deep in it on the outskirts of Moscow or the ruins of Stalingrad. They fought not for Stalin or ideology, but because the war had come to their doorsteps. Entire villages were emptied as young men were sent to the front. In frozen trenches, they prayed quietly, their breath turning to mist in the night. They carved crescent moons onto rifle stocks and whispered verses from memory before battle. Among them was Musa Jalil, a Tatar poet who became both soldier and symbol. Captured by the Nazis, he refused to cooperate and secretly wrote poems of resistance on scraps of paper torn from cement sacks. He was executed in 1944, but his verses survived, smuggled out of prison, later published as the Moabit Notebooks. In the Soviet Union, he was named a hero of the state. In the Muslim world, a martyr of faith and courage. Others became tank operators, snipers, engineers, ordinary men performing extraordinary acts. In the Battle of Stalingrad, Muslim soldiers from Central Asia helped turn the tide of the war, fighting house by house, room by room, in the ruins of a dead city. But their loyalty was constantly questioned. The Soviet regime distrusted religion, even as it relied on believers to survive. Many Muslim soldiers returned home to find their mosques closed, their culture suppressed, and their faith treated as a threat. Still, they remembered the front lines differently. To them, it wasn't about Stalin or socialism. It was about brotherhood, the man in the trench beside you, the family you might never see again, and the belief that courage and faith could coexist, even in a godless war. They didn't ask for monuments. Their monument was the land they defended, the frozen soil of Russia, where so many of them now rest beneath the snow. Chapter 4. Faith Under Fire. For the Muslim soldiers of World War II, war was not only a struggle for survival, it was also a test of faith. Whether in the deserts of North Africa, the jungles of Burma, or the ruins of Europe, they carried their religion with them like an invisible armor. They prayed in silence before battles, using their helmets as makeshift ablution bowls. They knelt on torn blankets amid the roar of artillery, whispering Bismillah as shells fell nearby. In the chaos of war, their routines of prayer, fasting, and remembrance became a fragile thread of humanity, a reminder of who they were and why they fought. In some regiments, the British Army appointed Muslim chaplains to help troops keep their faith. Field imams led prayers under the open sky, while cooks did their best to prepare food according to halal rules. During Ramadan, soldiers tried to fast, even under the burning sun of the Sahara or the endless rain of Burma. Commanders often protested. They said it weakened the men. But for the soldiers, fasting wasn't a burden. It was proof that even in war, the spirit could not be conquered. Letters from the front spoke of longing for home and the comfort of the call to prayer. Some soldiers wrote about the guilt of killing, others about finding strength in the words of the Quran. They spoke of seeing death so often that only faith kept them from losing their sanity. In the Free French Army, Algerian and Moroccan troops carried small Qurans sewn into their tunics. In the Indian divisions, soldiers built tiny mosques from mud and stone behind the lines. When they buried their fallen, they faced them toward Mecca, even when no one else understood why it mattered. For them, faith was not ideology, it was identity. It gave meaning to suffering, dignity to obedience, and comfort in a world gone mad. While others fought for empire, for ideology, or for vengeance, they fought with a different kind of conviction, that courage itself was a form of worship, and that dying with honor was a victory no enemy could take away. In the smoke and dust of war, their prayers were not loud, but they endured, echoing softly between the gunfire and the silence that followed. Chapter 5. When the war was over. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the world celebrated. Cities lit up, flags waved, and nations rejoiced at the end of 6 years of destruction. But for the millions of Muslim soldiers who had fought beneath those flags, victory came with a strange emptiness. They had risked their lives to defend lands that were not their own, only to return to countries still ruled by colonial powers. Many came home wearing British or French medals, symbols of valor in Europe, but of obedience at home. For them, the war's end was not liberation. It was a reminder that the freedom they had fought for still belonged to others. In India, returning veterans found their homeland divided between Muslims and Hindus on the edge of independence and civil war. The same men who had fought side by side in Burma now faced each other across new borders. Some joined the armies of newly created Pakistan, others stayed behind in India. Their shared sacrifice was forgotten amid politics and partition. In North Africa, the soldiers of the Free French Army returned to colonies still under French rule. Many expected gratitude. Instead, they met suspicion and repression. In 1945, just months after the war, demonstrations in Algeria demanding independence were crushed by French forces, the same army they had served in Italy and France. Thousands of veterans and civilians were killed. The Soviets, too, had little mercy for their Muslim soldiers. Many who had fought bravely were accused of disloyalty or religious fanaticism and sent to labor camps. Their faith, once a source of strength in battle, became a mark of suspicion in peace. Some veterans tried to build new lives in silence, working in fields, factories, and ports. Others carried invisible scars, the nightmares of battle, the weight of loss, the feeling of being used and discarded. They had marched across the world, seen the worst of humanity, and come home to be ignored. When history was written, their names were missing. In textbooks and memorials, the war became a story of white faces and European fronts. The brown and black soldiers, the Muslims who prayed in the trenches and died in foreign soil, were erased, not by malice, but by indifference. For decades, their children would grow up hearing whispers about the war, fragments of stories told at night by fathers who stared too long into the dark. And only much later would the world begin to ask, who were these men we forgot? Chapter 6. Rediscovering the Forgotten. For almost half a century, the story of Muslim soldiers in World War II lived only in memories, fading with each passing generation. But slowly, the silence began to crack. Historians, filmmakers, and grandchildren of veterans started searching through letters, photos, and military records to rebuild the truth. In Britain, the discovery began in the cemeteries, rows of identical white gravestones, each carved with a crescent instead of a cross. Names like Abdul Rahman, Yusuf Khan, Ali Mahmoud, buried side by side with British soldiers, far from the homelands they'd never see again. Some stones simply read, "A soldier of the Indian Army, known unto God." In France, plaques appeared in small villages once liberated by Moroccan or Algerian troops. Locals began to realize that the men who had freed them spoke Arabic, prayed in a different way, and never returned home. In Italy, old photographs surfaced of Muslim soldiers building a mosque in the ruins near Monte Cassino. The British Commonwealth War Graves Commission quietly maintained thousands of Muslim graves for decades. But only recently did documentaries and public projects begin to tell their stories. BBC reporters interviewed surviving veterans, men in their 90s, their eyes bright with pride and sadness. They spoke softly of the friends they buried, the prayers whispered under gunfire, and the hope that someday people would remember them. In Pakistan and Bangladesh, families found faded medals in old chests. In Morocco and Tunisia, researchers uncovered lists of men who died under French command, forgotten by both the empire they served and the nations they came from. Museums and universities started collecting oral histories, gathering testimonies from across the Muslim world. The narrative began to shift, from silence to acknowledgement. Schools began to include them in lessons about the war. In Britain, new memorials were built, inscribed with Arabic calligraphy, "We gave our today for your tomorrow." And for the descendants of those soldiers, it was more than history. It was identity, a connection to courage, to sacrifice, to a legacy that had been taken from them. They realized their ancestors were not just victims of empire. They were builders of freedom, part of a global struggle that reshaped the world. The war had tried to erase them. Time had almost succeeded, but the truth, once found, began to shine again, carried by the same quiet dignity that guided them through battle, faith, duty, and the belief that every act of courage matters even if no one is watching. Epilogue. The Echo of Brotherhood. Today, the winds that once carried the dust of war now sweep over the quiet fields and cemeteries where those soldiers rest. The world they helped save has long forgotten their faces, but their presence lingers in the soil, in the records, in the prayers whispered over their graves. Their story is not one of empires or conquests, but of people, ordinary men from distant lands who answered a call greater than themselves. They didn't fight for glory or medals. They fought because they believed in duty, because a comrade's life mattered more than ideology, because to protect the innocent was a form of faith in action. From the mountains of Italy to the dunes of Libya, from the jungles of Burma to the streets of Paris, they left behind a quiet legacy of courage without recognition, sacrifice without reward. They fought in the name of peace, even as the world around them burned. Now, decades later, the echoes of their voices are being heard again. In schools, in documentaries, in the hearts of their descendants who are piecing together what was once lost. Their stories are being told not out of nostalgia, but out of justice, because history is not whole without them. At memorials in London, Paris, Delhi, and Rabat, the names once buried under silence are being spoken aloud. Young people of every faith stand before those graves and read the inscriptions carved in both Latin and Arabic script. They see that courage has no color, that faith and heroism can exist side by side. The men who prayed before battle, who crossed seas for freedom, who faced death with God's name on their lips, they belong to all of us now. Their story is not just Muslim history, but human history, because when the world was collapsing, they stood firm. When others turned away, they marched forward. And when victory came, they asked for nothing, only to be remembered. Their legacy whispers through time, gentle yet unyielding, that courage, faith, and brotherhood are never truly forgotten. Additional epilogue. The other side of the faith. As the war dragged on, even the architects of terror grew desperate for soldiers. By 1943, Germany was losing on every front, its armies exhausted, its manpower fading. And so, the same regime that had once preached racial purity began to look toward the very people it had once called inferior. The Nazis turned their gaze to the Muslim world. They knew faith could inspire loyalty, and they tried to twist it. Propaganda spread across North Africa, the Middle East, and the Balkans. Pamphlets claiming that Germany respected Islam, that Hitler was an ally against Western imperialism and atheist communism. Mosques were photographed, imams were courted, and promises were made, all to lure believers into fighting for a cause that despised them. Some responded not out of devotion to Hitler, but out of survival, revenge, or hatred for colonial powers. In Bosnia, the 13th Waffen-SS Handschar Division was formed, a Muslim unit under Nazi command. They wore fezes, carried Qurans, and were told they were fighting for faith. But in truth, they were pawns in a war that had already lost its soul. The irony was brutal. While Muslim soldiers fought and died for freedom in Allied uniforms, others, misled and manipulated, were sent to die under a banner of lies. Faith, the same force that gave courage to the oppressed, was being exploited by the oppressor. Most of these recruits never saw Berlin. Many deserted or refused orders when they discovered what the Nazi cause truly was. Some even turned their weapons against their German officers. Their brief existence became another footnote in a war defined by contradictions, a war where good and evil were often separated not by nationality, but by choice. And so, when the world finally emerged from that darkness, the Muslim story of World War II became more than just one of forgotten service. It became a mirror of human complexity. Some fought for empire, some fought for freedom, some were deceived, but many on every front fought simply to survive, to protect families, faith, and the hope that decency might outlive the war. In the end, the Nazis' attempt to weaponize Islam failed, because faith built on hate cannot endure. But the legacy of the Muslim soldiers who fought for justice, who prayed in trenches and deserts for peace, did endure. They remind us that war can corrupt faith, but faith, at its best, can redeem even war. Thank you for watching. Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Maybe you have a story to share about these heroes, or someone else from the war years. After this moment, you'll see the names of the Muslim soldiers who fought and were forgotten across the deserts, jungles, and battlefields of World War II. They came from every corner of the world, from Morocco to India, from Albania to Indonesia, united not by empire, but by faith, courage, and hope. Stay healthy, subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and see you in the next one. And if you have an idea for another untold story, share it in the comments. Your voice helps keep their memory alive.